What do you say to a subordinate when the rules of civilization completely collapse on the battlefield? Imagine standing over a map of Europe, knowing that your men are being systematically hunted not for their tactical value but out of pure desperation. For one commander, the choice was simple yet terrifyingly illegal under the laws of modern warfare. He watched through binoculars as an American medical and rescue convoy wound its way through the smoldering ruins of a shattered village. They carried no heavy weapons, only the Red Cross painted on their canvas tops and the hope of saving the wounded. Yet the order he whispered into his radio would set off a chain reaction of violence that no one in the high command could stop. It was a calculated gamble designed to stall an unstoppable advance, but it would instead unleash a legendary wrath. If his plan succeeded, he would buy his retreating division another precious day to escape across the river. If it failed, he would draw the personal attention of the most ruthless battlefield general the United States had ever produced. The trap was sprung in a flash of artillery fire, and what happened next would change the nature of the Western Front forever. The consequences of that single radio transmission would soon ripple through the entire theater of war, transforming a standard tactical retreat into a brutal blood feud. For the men on the ground, it was no longer just about capturing territory or securing strategic bridges. It became a deeply personal struggle for survival against an enemy that had decided to throw away the rulebook. In the halls of the Supreme Allied Command generals whispered about the political fallout of a rogue operation that threatened to destabilize the fragile coalition. An entire armored division was about to be redirected from its primary objective, risking a massive gap in the Allied front line just to satisfy a burning desire for retribution. Historians would later argue whether the resulting operation was a brilliant display of military justice or a reckless abuse of absolute power. The line between tactical necessity and personal vengeance began to blur as thousands of tons of steel were set in motion. Every soldier involved knew that a line had been crossed, and there was absolutely no turning back now. But the true scale of the approaching storm was something the German defenders could not possibly comprehend. Before we uncover the terrifying price that would be paid for this battlefield betrayal, take a moment to secure your place in this unfolding history. By subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell, you ensure that these lost chapters of human conflict are never forgotten. Your engagement through likes and comments helps keep these cinematic investigations alive, allowing us to dig deeper into the shadows of the past. Share this journey with those who appreciate the raw truth of leadership under maximum pressure. Now, as the smoke clears from the initial ambush, we must look at the hidden cracks in the front line that made such an atrocity possible. The European winter was fading, but the ground remained a treacherous quagmire of mud and broken promises. The German army was collapsing inward like a dying star, yet its remaining officers were often the most fanatical and dangerous. They were men with nothing left to lose, fighting for a regime that executed anyone showing signs of weakness. In this environment of absolute terror, conventional military ethics became a luxury that few frontline commanders felt they could afford. The tension had been building for weeks as the American Third Army pushed deeper into territory that had not seen an invader in generations. The pace of the advance was so rapid that logistics could barely keep up, leaving small units isolated in a sea of hostile terrain. Rescue teams and medical detachments routinely operated in the gray zones between advancing columns, relying on international law for protection. They moved through the fog with a false sense of security, believing that even in total war certain boundaries remained sacred. But on the other side of the ridge, the German commander was facing a mutiny from his own starved and exhausted troops. His artillery was nearly out of ammunition, and his fuel reserves could be measured in mere gallons. To him, the approaching American rescue vehicles were not a humanitarian mission, but a mobile stockpile of precious supplies. He viewed the Red Crosses not as a shield, but as a convenient bullseye that guaranteed a helpless target. He knew the risks of violating the Geneva Convention, but the immediate survival of his command outweighed any future trial. This was a man broken by years of relentless warfare on multiple fronts, having witnessed the destruction of his original regiment. He possessed a cold, analytical mind that treated human lives as simple variables in a losing mathematical equation. His virtues were limited to an iron discipline that kept his men fighting long after hope had died. Yet his fatal flaw was a profound arrogance that led him to believe he could outmaneuver the American high command through sheer brutality. He feared the wrath of his own superiors in Berlin far more than he respected the laws of civilized warfare. Under intense psychological pressure to produce a victory, he chose to gamble the honor of his entire unit on a single ambush. Opposite him across the smoke-choked valley was an American general who operated on an entirely different plane of intensity. This general was a man driven by a romantic destiny, believing himself to be a modern reincarnation of ancient warriors. He possessed a volatile temper that could erupt over a dirty uniform, but he held an absolute devotion to his soldiers. When the first reports of the ambush reached the American headquarters, the atmosphere instantly transformed from routine planning to suffocating tension. The radio crackled with chaotic distress calls that abruptly cut out into static, leaving a deafening silence in the briefing room. Initial data confirmed that the rescue team had been systematically targeted and wiped out, with survivors taken into the freezing woods. The political staff immediately urged caution, warning that a rash response could disrupt the broader strategy for the upcoming offensive. They argued that resources could not be diverted for a minor local incident when the main assault was scheduled to begin within hours. The general listened in absolute silence, his jaw tight and his hands clenched into fists behind his back. His advisors watched him carefully, knowing that the internal storm brewing inside him was far more dangerous than the enemy. He viewed the ambush not merely as a tactical setback, but as an unforgivable insult to the American uniform. The pressure to maintain the theater timeline was immense, but some lines could never be crossed without an immediate response. The regular chain of command began to fracture as arguments erupted over the proper utilization of the remaining armored reserves. Staff officers pointed out that the mud made off-road movement nearly impossible, restricting any retaliatory force to predictable, highly defended bottlenecks. The German commander had already anticipated a standard counterattack and had positioned his anti-tank guns along the main highway. He had turned the surrounding villages into a series of interlocking kill zones designed to bleed any pursuing force dry. If the Americans rushed blindly into the valley, they would play directly into a carefully prepared trap. The political stakes grew higher by the minute as messages from Supreme Headquarters demanded total adherence to the original invasion plan. The general was walking a treacherous political tightrope, balancing his career against his duty to his murdered men. He knew that a single misstep would result in his immediate removal from command and a permanent stain on his legacy. Yet the ticking clock left no room for bureaucratic hesitation or diplomatic compromise. The critical turning point arrived at midnight when a lone survivor of the rescue team managed to crawl back to the American lines. His eyewitness account of the German commander's personal involvement shattered any remaining hope for a peaceful resolution. The general bypassed his staff entirely and walked directly to the massive operational map hanging on the wall. With a single sharp motion, he drew a red line across the sector, effectively canceling weeks of meticulous Allied planning. He ordered an entire combat command of Sherman tanks to detach from the main advance and turn 90 degrees north. This decision created an immediate vulnerability in the Allied flank, leaving a wide gap that a clever enemy could exploit. The staff stood paralyzed as they realized the general was risking the entire regional campaign for a single objective. He looked at them and stated that if they did not punish this treachery immediately, the war was already lost morally. The orders were cut in secret, ensuring that the Supreme Commander would not find out until the tanks were already rolling. Before we witness the devastating collision that followed this radical defiance of orders, consider the ultimate cost of battlefield leadership. Your support through subscribing and sharing allows us to continue unearthing these pivotal moments where human decisions altered history. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on whether the general was justified in risking the campaign for his men. Now the gears of an industrial war machine were turning with a terrifying velocity that no single division could hope to withstand. The American tanks roared to life in the darkness, their exhausts spitting blue flames into the cold night air. They moved without lights, relying on the instincts of drivers who had been fighting across Europe for months. The ground trembled beneath 30,000 tons of moving steel as the spearhead advanced into the gray morning fog. The German sentries heard the low rumble of engines and realized their calculations had been completely and catastrophically wrong. They had expected a cautious infantry probe, but instead they were facing the unbridled fury of a mechanized monster. The German commander woke to the sound of distant explosions that rapidly grew into a continuous deafening roar along his perimeter. His forward outposts were not just being pushed back, they were being completely erased from the map by concentrated artillery. The speed of the American movement defied every logistical reality of the winter terrain, forcing his men into a panic. He ordered his anti-tank guns to open fire, but the sheer volume of the incoming armor overwhelmed his positions instantly. The defensive lines he had spent days constructing were bypassed in minutes as the tanks drove straight through the burning buildings. His infantry began to scatter into the woods, throwing away their weapons as the mechanical wall advanced relentlessly. He tried to organize a secondary defense line at the river crossing, but his communications network was entirely destroyed. The walls were rapidly closing in on his position, and the cold realization of his mistake began to settle in. He had poked a sleeping giant, and there was no fortress in Europe that could save him now. The tactical masterpiece of the revenge operation lay in its total lack of restraint or conventional caution. The general had authorized the use of experimental white phosphorus shells that turned the enemy fortifications into raging infernos within seconds. The American tank crews drove with an aggressive fury that shocked even their own veteran non-commissioned officers. They did not stop to take prisoners or secure territory, they simply crushed everything that stood in their direct path. The German commander found himself trapped in a pocket of land with his back completely against the deep rushing river. His remaining tanks were out of fuel, turned into static metal coffins that were easily picked off by the advancing Shermans. He desperately drafted a surrender message, hoping to appeal to the very laws of war he had violated hours earlier. But the radio operator refused to transmit it, knowing that the Americans were no longer listening to explanations. The battle had ceased to be an engagement between two armies and had become a systematic execution of a broken command. The final stand took place around a medieval stone church where the German commander had established his last desperate headquarters. He stood in the courtyard as his personal guard was cut down by a hail of heavy machine gun fire from all sides. The American tanks tore down the stone wall's iron treads, grinding the ancient masonry into dust as they entered the plaza. A single dust-covered jeep pulled up to the center of the ruins, carrying an officer who represented the general's wrath. The German commander stepped forward, offering his ceremonial pistol in a final bid for a dignified military surrender. The American officer did not accept the weapon, but instead looked at the smoldering remains of the rescue vehicles nearby. He informed the German that his surrender was not recognized under the terms he had established the previous day. The crushing revenge was not a quick execution, but the total public humiliation and dismantling of his entire military legacy. He was stripped of his rank on the spot and forced to watch the final destruction of his unit. The aftermath of the operation sent shockwaves through the highest levels of both the Allied and Axis military commands. The German High Command realized that the Western Front had entered a new phase of total ruthlessness where no quarter would be given. The general had proved that any violation of humanity would be met with an overwhelming application of destructive power. The political fallout within the Allied camp was severe, with demands for the general's immediate court-martial for defying direct orders. But the success of the operation could not be argued, as it had accidentally cleared a major highway to the Rhine. The strategic gap that had worried the staff was quickly closed by a wave of freshly arrived infantry divisions. The general walked through the liberated valley, his boots stepping over the debris of the force that had dared to touch his men. He had saved the honor of his army, but he had also solidified his reputation as a loose cannon. The answer to what he told his staff was written in the smoking craters that stretched for miles. The destiny of the characters involved would be forever defined by those 24 hours of absolute violence. The German commander spent the remainder of the conflict in a maximum security prison camp, stripped of all honors and despised by his peers. His family name was ruined, and he would eventually face a war crimes tribunal that used his own radio logs as evidence. The general survived the political storm, his value to the war effort far outweighing his flagrant disregard for bureaucratic protocol. His men revered him even more than before, creating a fierce loyalty that would carry them all the way to Berlin. The story of the crushed rescue team and the terrifying revenge that followed became a cautionary tale whispered in military academies. It proved that even in the chaotic madness of total war, there are certain lines that cannot be crossed without inviting total destruction. The landscape eventually recovered, with green grass covering the scars of the battlefield, but the memory of the wrath remained etched in history. The ultimate lesson of this forgotten clash lies not in the strategic layout of the front, but in the human cost. For months after the guns fell silent, locals found the discarded fragments of military gear embedded in the fertile soil. The High Command closed its files on the incident, choosing to focus on the grand race to capture the capital. Yet the soldiers who rode in those tanks never forgot the day their general chose to rewrite the rules. They carried the memory of that brutal winter village into their quiet civilian lives as a dark reminder of power. The general himself never publicly commented on the precise words he used to launch that devastating regional offensive. He allowed the scorched earth and the shattered remnants of the enemy division to speak clearly for his intentions. History recorded the victory as just another tactical milestone on the long road to total victory across Europe. But for those who survived the morning of the ambush, it was the moment the war lost its final mask.